I believe that God is saying to us today that our vision will be in proportion to our faith. We have a goal to accomplish to reach Kitchener-Waterloo with the gospel of Jesus Christ. What part can I play in it? That's our desire, is that we might show the love of God to people so that they can find God.
Celebration Sunday, take one. Flemings, please.
I'm Steve Fleming, founding pastor of Koinonia Christian Fellowship.
And I'm Beth Fleming, his wife and partner.
And founding pastor of Koinonia Christian Fellowship.
Yes. Steve and I were living in Brantford, Ontario, and we were serving in our local church.
I had prayed one day, I had a restlessness. I felt like there was something else or something more that God was asking us to do, and I didn't know what that was. And we were quite busy. We didn't have any children, and we were really fully engaged in the local church. We saw people go out and launch churches, and many of them didn't work. And we always thought that if God was going to call us, he'd have it hit in the head with a 2x4, because we weren't going anywhere. And then really there was like a prophetic word in church one day. One of the elders was speaking, and he said things were happening so quickly. A year from now, Steve, you could be pastoring. And that, it was like, interesting.
When we began to talk about that, I felt like God was developing in me a pastor's heart. And I don't know how to describe it, but when we were leading the home group, and it had grown to about 35 adults, we had opportunity there to serve them, to care for them, to create community, to lead people into salvation and see people healed. So it was like God was growing us and stretching us.
We had gone to a meeting and had went for prayer at the end of this meeting, and fell out under the power of God. And the lady who was leading the meeting, she didn't touch me. I just fell under the power of God, and I'm on this floor, and I couldn't move. I experienced this, the power of God in such a powerful way. And everybody dismissed at the end and went out to the foyer, and they left an usher with me. I'm laying on the floor. I can't move. I can move my eyeballs, and I could talk, and that was it. And I didn't know what was going on. I just really was praying, asking God what's happening, and felt like the Holy Spirit said, you're afraid of this. And I was terrified. And God said, I want you to know that it's going to be my power, not your power. So we were pretty convinced that this was a God thing. And I was a grade 12 grad, no Bible school. God just said, I have a work for you to do, and I'm going to do it. I preached on a Sunday night, the last time we were at that church. That was the first time I got to preach. They gave us an overhead projector as a gift to start, and gave us $100 a month for the first year.
So we were well prepared. Oh my gosh, we were so green. We didn't have a clue.
We did a little church ad.
That's right, church ads in newspapers.
Yeah.
That's what we did.
And that was about it. And then it's word of mouth after that. Well, Koinonia was something we really felt God spoke to us about the church, and it had to do with fellowship and partnership, and it described both the relationship that we have personally with God, but also with each other. Our first Sunday was at Waterloo Inn, and we met there actually for about 2.5 years, I guess it was altogether. But after meeting in a farmhouse for 8 weeks, we actually went to the Waterloo Inn. And I think there was 42 or something on the launch Sunday at the Waterloo Inn. And our children's ministry room was actually called the Bloomingdale Room. So we got Beth and I, and Beth's, her specialty it was children. And I was a worship leader. Brian and Gail had been trained by Beth and worked with Beth in children's ministry. Brian and I were on the worship team together. The Schmitz, George was our head usher. He'd ushered for years. And Barb, her passion was children and babies, so she looked after the nursery. And the other couple, she was worked with children's ministry with Gail as well, and her husband was our assistant head usher. So we had our key areas
And they were mechanics, so when
Yeah.
our van broke down that had all our stuff,
Yeah,
they'd pull it or repair it.
and they did both on Sunday mornings.
It's good to see that not much has changed in church planting in 40 years.
In the early, this would be the second year of the church,
think
probably second, third year of the church. We had a family that started attending week 2, and their son was 18 months at the time, but he was not well. It took a while to get a diagnosis, but it was eventually determined he had 2 malabsorption diseases, and he would not see his 5th birthday. So, of course, that weighs heavy on the parents' hearts, on the body of Koinonia at the time. Was very invested in praying for Matthew. And so we had our first all-night prayer meeting to pray for him and another little boy that was seriously ill as well. And partway through the night, Steve had a vision.
Yeah, I had a vision of Matthew Turton. I had a vision of him eating cake on his 5th birthday because the doctors had said he would not live to see his 5th birthday. Mm-hmm. And I really felt strongly that we were done, that was
we were done praying.
We were done praying, that really was an answer to prayer. And it was, he actually got worse for a little bit. Mm-hmm. We were really tough on Pauline and Terry. We continued to pray and believe God together. But he was totally healed and brought cake to church on his 5th birthday. And we all had a little piece of cake and celebrated. And Matthew and his family, his kids, all go to Koinonia today. So, see, we came out of a charismatic movement that actually, in many cases, demonstrated a greater concern for adults than children. Mm-hmm. And so part of what we were is that we weren't going to go without our kids. And the 2 scriptures God gave us, actually, one was Moses, where he refused to go out and worship. Pharaoh wanted him to leave the kids behind. And Moses says, no, we're going to go together. Mm-hmm. And the other was Jacob's returning. And Esau says, come with me. And Jacob says, no, we're going to go a little slower so that for the benefit of the children. And so it was like we wanted to do church together as generations. Yeah. And we weren't going to do it. We were just as concerned for our kids as we were for our own spiritual health. And that was not out of the charismatic movement. That was not necessarily normal. And then we wanted to do it with worship. And so we had the kids in for years because we wanted them to experience worship and we wanted them to see their parents worshiping. So they didn't think it was just a kid thing.
Just an adult thing.
Yeah, no. If they were only worshiping on their own, then it's a kid's thing. We wanted them to see that it was
I see.
Young and old, all of us worshiping together.
Yes.
In September, for those of you who don't know, we'll be launching a new church here in the city of Waterloo. And it's going to.
I remember meeting Steve at a City Watch event. They just had this interesting way, Steve and Beth, of just kind of being a part of our early days of Slate, whether it be through the first ARC training that was done in Ontario, which is the church planning organization we launched Slate Church through, was done actually here in Bloomingdale. And I remember going into the green room or the ready room, whatever we call that room. And I remember that's actually where the whole ARC team commissioned us to go and plant Slate Church.
Yeah, so in launching Slate Church, the desire was for an intergenerational church. We had been pastoring a student church for several years at that point.
One of the churches that we looked up to in the area and we're trying to emulate as a church when we were first starting was Koinonia. We had a great respect for the history and the legacy that was built out here in Bloomingdale.
And we just really felt God put it on our hearts to launch into something new, something that was for all generations, that kids and young adults and students and adults and people in every stage of life could actually join together, worshiping God as we kind of see outlined in Scripture. And so that was a really key focus on Slate Church, was that it was an intergenerational church.
One of the values was The mission stays the same, but the method always changes. And that was pretty core to those early days because we wanted to do everything we could to reach this region and the city we found ourselves in. And so while the mission is always to reach people for Jesus, to introduce them to the love of God and be discipled ourselves, the way in which we approach that, we would try anything in order to see people either come to Slate or introduce them to Jesus or have them find themselves in Christian community.
So we had talked about wanting to be an intergenerational church, but as we were looking towards doing that and launching Slate Church, we were launching with students. Almost everyone a part of the church was a student, and there were some people from different kind of generations, but we were hoping and excited for kids ministry and what that would look like. And there were just a couple of families, and as we were launching Slate Church, more families began to come. We were able to start having Slate Kids and all of these things happening, but still it was just a handful of kids really that was there at the start.
I remember Jeff Carlsa, he was on our board at the time, just giving us the warning. He's like, with all of the students that you see, he said, set a timer. You're about to see explosive growth in your kids' ministry.
I remember when we were in the pandemic, all of a sudden, I think it was 2019, 2020, I was counting how many pregnancies there were in the church. And I think in the course of that year, that 2020 year, 25 babies were born in Slate Church just in that year, not including all of the ones who had come and joined in at that point, and all of the families.
And it hasn't been slowing down.
It has not been slowing down.
Yeah.
Now we just continue to see kind of explosive growth. And so this desire, this hope for an intergenerational church, I mean, we're now seeing the fruit of that literally in Slate Kids every single week.
Well, it's cool to see a bunch of friends who were students that you launched this church with. All of a sudden, there's like their mini-me's just like running around the church. And it's a lot of fun because you can literally see the future leadership of the church. And they're not even just the future leaders, like they're already making an impact. The stories we're hearing of these kids going into their schools and sharing Jesus and just being, it's really, really cool to see.
Guys, what are you doing at the office?
I just remember being in the office one day, and I think it's when we started to come to terms. Like the pandemic was really hard, but there was a moment when I think that we realized that our church may actually be slightly growing through the pandemic. That all of a sudden, it felt like nowhere, this passion for Koinonia just started like being impressed upon my spirit. I remember having an initial conversation with Tim and Julia Hutchison, who had at one point been at Koinonia, and were now, Julia was on staff, she was my assistant. I shared with them, like, I don't know, I can't get Koinonia off my mind.
And I just felt my spirit, God drop Deuteronomy 28 into my spirit. I really had no context. I don't have all of Deuteronomy memorized. And so I flipped there. And as I began reading, it's Moses addressing the Israelites, and it's all about obedience. You will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. And it was in that moment that for me, myself personally, and I shared this with the group.
I think our entire leadership team in that moment, when you read that, knew that this is something we needed to do and to yield ourselves to. And it was this prompting by God, and at the time, I didn't think I had the right language for it, but it developed over a year and a half to this phrase of, why are we two different churches? And that just kept growing on me because, you know, looking years into my past, I remember coming to Koinonia for the first time when I started dating you. Your parents brought us here. And that set an initial vision for what church could be into my mind, even though I didn't really have another connection with them. Like I never really ever attended here or served here at Koinonia. But it set something off in my mind. And then a year and a half before I started talking to Brian, this phrase started to get chiseled into my mind. Why are we two different churches? And that's what I felt the Holy Spirit putting on me. And so when I approached Pastor Brian, I mean, that's through a lot of, I'm usually quite clear in the way that I'm communicating. I would say if there was a moment in my life where I lacked clarity on what I was trying to communicate, it was because I was so nervous. I didn't want to ruin my relationship with Koinonia as two churches in the city. I didn't want to ruin my relationship with Brian and all of the people that I'd played sports with over the years from Koinonia. And just what kind of came out was, I don't know why you're two different churches. What if we merged? The first part was like birthed out of just lots of prayer, a year and a half. The second part of merging would take another year, a year and a half to actually work itself out through leadership. But it was quite clear in those early conversations that God was in this.
Second six, Pastor Brian, take one.
I remember getting this text from Pastor Brandon, and he said, hey, can we get together and pray? And there was just something about the way he communicated at this time that it's just something in my spirit leaped that there was something deeper in the conversation he wanted to have. And so we got together, and it was September of 2022, September 21st, if you want to know the actual date, because I remember sitting down together, and he was just so respectful of Koinonia and what God has been doing through this church over many years. He was respectful of Pastor Stephen Beth. He was respectful of Rebecca and I. And he almost looked nervous to share with me something that he said God had put on his heart to pray over for a significant period of time. I remember praying in that moment, just saying, Lord, why is he so nervous? What is it he's going to share with me? God, what are you possibly calling us into? And all I sensed was the word merging come to my mind. And it never was even a thought before that. And so I took 48 hours. And when I was leading up to that, I said to our elders here at Koinonia, I said, there's something exciting that God could be doing. And I shared with them the conversation I had with Brandon. And I said, I don't want you to tell your spouse. I don't want you to tell anyone. I want you to pray with me. And so I knew they were praying while I was away praying. And those were some moments for me just to get alone and get quiet and to submit all of these ideas with God, because at Koinonia, we had been, as a leadership and as a community, been wondering, God, what's next? You've called us into fresh vision for making disciples in our region and beyond, but how do we do it? And what's next for us? The next meeting I remember Brandon and I being really anxious and nervous about was bringing our leadership together to sign what we called a kingdom commitment. And it was us just saying, we're committed to the kingdom, and here's what we're committed as two churches toward this new vision together. And yet, as we came into the room, we could just sense there was anticipation, there was excitement and eagerness to not get through the night, but to what God was birthing before us. And there was spontaneity that happened that night. Somebody said, let's just worship. And so somebody led out in worship, and in unity in a circle we worship. Equal to it was our next gathering as leaders when we came together to officially sign and say, we're committed to this going forward. And that meeting, we had communion together. We broke bread together. We talked about how Christ gave his life to unite us as one body. And here we were experiencing this in our city, in our church communities, not even fully knowing what God had in store next. I remember our two communities coming together for a worship night, and there was anticipation of what's it going to be like? Are we going to like each other? Are we going to sing the same songs? What is praying going to be like together? So there was a lot of that, just kind of feeling it out, and what's it going to be like to serve together? But once we started to sing, and once we heard words of prayer, and Brandon stepping into moments, I stepped into moments that night and just speaking out direction, what was on our hearts as leaders and what we could see the body of Christ responding to. It was like, I remember somebody saying to me after that night, they said, it feels like we're one already. And that was early in the stages, but we knew God was at work in our community, bringing us together. During this journey, I've had lots of conversations with people outside of our churches as well. And some of them are asking me, so why merge? Why are you doing this? Like, Koinonia has 40 years of history. Slate has lots of ministry experience in years. And why would you do this? And I remember the stirring in me that Brandon and I would hear him say the same was because God's calling us into something that is part of his vision in his heart. And so we're willing to say, yes, God. We're going to go where you are because we want to be involved in the work that you're already doing. And I believe from my very early prayer times about this merge that when we yield and submit something to God, God will birth, he'll grow, he'll increase, he'll multiply something that's even greater than we can think right now or imagine or try and create ourselves, because God's birthing something new. So we know there's other churches watching, there's other people watching, and that's why we're committed to pray, to worship together, to work through differences, and to come to unity to say, yes, God, keep building your church so you can reach more disciples in Ontario and beyond.
You know, as we hear of the past of Koinonia and the past of Slate Church and the history that's there, that is so rich in what God is doing, and he's doing it through his people. I think we see that across the board, that the Spirit has just moved over the years, whether it's a shorter history of Slate Church, 6.5 years old, of Koinonia, 40 years old, almost to the day, really, of when things got started with Pastor Stephen Beth. It's just been incredible to see how God has moved, and he's used all of us. And I think that really is such a significant piece, that we get to be a part of his plan, that we get to be a part of what he is doing. We have in the past, and we will again in the future. And that's encouraging for us. I hope that's encouraging for you as well, that we are all a part of this. Whether our history tracks back 2 years, 2 months, 2 decades, whatever that looks like, this is significant, what God has done, but he is not finished yet. He's not done yet. We believe it. We hope that you believe it too, that there's a lot of good in store here.
Yeah, and it's not just significant. There's a resounding word in my mind right now. It's miraculous.
Yeah.
When I think of all of the stories that Steve and Beth and Pastor Brian have shared of the history of Koinonia, you see miracles in people's lives, and you see miracles corporately. You think of just the things that have happened in individuals' lives where we have come to God in prayer, but then also the building of facilities and the events that happened and the things that drew people unto God corporately. I mean, that's the same story at Slate Church. We have seen miracles in people's lives, but then we've also seen God move amongst the church corporately in miraculous ways as well. It's a story of miracles and sacrifice. It's a story of God's leading, and it's a story of his people's obedience. Overarching all of this, it's a story of God's faithfulness. And the good thing is that this story isn't being ended. That was chapter 1 for each of the congregations, but in chapter 2, I really believe that God is going to continue his faithfulness, and we're going to